the Institute brings together people with very different backgrounds, and particularly people on the technical engineering side who work on various aspects of media technology, and people from content creation. At Columbia, the Institute is anchored in the Graduate School of Journalism. At Stanford, the Institute is anchored in the School of Engineering. So in this way, the Institute is also a bridge between New York City, which is the foremost hub of media technology, and the foremost hub of information technology, Silicon Valley. So to bring these two institutions together and these two schools, which as you might expect have very different cultures, we often have to be creative. And I'll just give you one small example of that. You might know, at least the Columbia people who are here today, of course, know that the color of Columbia University is blue and the color of Stanford University is cardinal. So what would we do for a website for a joint institute between the two? So we decided to actually cycle through the color schemes of old cosmopolitan cover pages from 50 years ago. And if you go to the website, and I encourage you to do this, it's a lot of fun. Every 2 weeks, the color changes. And Mark Hansen, who's my counterpart at Columbia, deserves credit for this idea. This also explains the pink flyer that you have received. So if you wonder where that pink comes from, it's not only the favorite color of Helen Gurley Brown, and of course was the color exactly like this of her 1962 book, Sex and the Single Girl, but it was also the Cosmo color scheme, I believe, of December 1965. So stay tuned and just observe how these wonderful colors change on our website, and maybe also in future flyers. So we are in our second year of operations now. We have currently 8 ongoing projects that either build innovative media platforms or develop innovative media products. And in the ideal case, they even do both. The topics at the intersection of computing and news media have naturally emerged as a focus area of the Institute. Every 2 or 3 months, we have an all-hands meeting where either people from Stanford go to New York City or people from New York City come here. And we are just at the end of a 1.5-day meeting here at Stanford where we have reviewed the progress of ongoing projects and discussed many new ideas. And we are all elated after this. This is very exciting what goes on in the program. And in fact, I'm always surprised when we get together and amazed on how powerful this combination is of media technology and journalism. This is really an idea whose time has come. So we're going to discuss about these topics with a very distinguished panel this afternoon. I'm just going to introduce our panel moderator, Professor Ann Grimes, and Ann is then going to introduce our panelists. Professor Grimes joined the Stanford faculty in 2005, and she directed Stanford's graduate program of journalism from 2006 until this year, in fact. She's an award-winning journalist who previously held several editorial positions at the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. And since we are co-presenting this event this afternoon with the Knight Fellowship Program, I should of course also mention that Ann was a Knight Fellow here at Stanford in 1997-1998. And last but not least, something that many of you might not know yet, Ann was recently appointed as Associate Director of the Brown Institute, joining me in leading the Institute here at Stanford. So this is another opportunity to say welcome and thank you for organizing this very exciting panel, Anne.
Before I introduce the panel, I'm going to say a few words about some of the issues before us here today. We are really excited to see so many people come out to hear today what we hope will be the first of a series of ongoing discussions that bring together hacks, as we journalists like to call ourselves, and hackers, which is a description used liberally by many of our colleagues in the technology world. I didn't coin that phrase. Hack and hackers is a name that was generated by my friend and entrepreneur Bert Herman when he was a Knight Fellow in 2009. Bert combined forces with Rich Gordon at the Medill Journalism School and the New York Times Alan Philhofer to build a network by that name, Hacks and Hackers. It now has a presence in over 50 cities around the globe, and its goal, like the Brown Institute's, is to bring together people interested at the intersection of journalism and technology. The explosive growth of that group, along with the healthy turnout here today, is an indication of the interest, I would say the deep interest, in the opportunities and challenges we both, hacks and hackers, face as technology and journalism increasingly intersect. We're at a historical time. News organizations continue to struggle due to the fallout of technology and a broken business model. This is especially true for newspapers, which still serve up most of the original watchdog reporting, the investigative stories and the ones that win Pulitzer Prizes, and play a key role in helping citizens stay informed in a democratic society. At the same time, the scope of the algorithmic revolution in digital knowledge production, the dynamic and rapid speed of developments in technology, advances in computer processing speed, social media, the growing ubiquity of data. The growing ubiquity of data continue to whipsaw how computer scientists and engineers process and analyze news and information. The era of big data, some might say big brother, is upon us. Our digital footprints do not vanish without a trace, but feed databases that, when compared with algorithms, serve up information that is relevant, geolocated, socially networked. Customization or personalization, aggregation and analytics, exploring the semantic web and closing the semantic gap, artificial intelligence, natural language processing, human-computer interaction. All these terms and skills are now shared by software engineers and reporters as both rethink journalistic innovation. A new field, some call it computational journalism, is emerging. Indeed, the idea of computational journalism has already affected the practice of news production. In academia, we are seeing new courses of interdisciplinary programs that train a new breed of coder journalists. In newsrooms, we are seeing new teams of developers/journalists or journalists/developers applying computational and visualization practices to news work. In the tech industry, we are seeing executives increasingly interested in the fallout of their work on news. Tech moguls, Jeff Bezos, Pierre Omidyar, and Chris Hughes have become publishers. In journalism, we are seeing big names leading legacy media for the uncertain promise of digital media. Heck, even Katie Couric last week has jumped on the bandwagon, announcing that she would cut short her contract with ABC News to help shape what Yahoo News will look like. Many argue that technology has destroyed journalism as we once knew it, but others say technology contains within it the seeds of rebirth. Among the many questions before us today is whether the impact of technology, and especially big data, will help make people's access to information more efficient and effective, or whether it will be used to track protesters in the streets. We in journalism and engineering and our guests who come at this topic from different perspectives hope our conversation today will shed light on this give and take. We hope our discussion will help us forge a roadmap to better understand the intersection between large-scale data collection, algorithmic analysis, computational practices, and the watchdog reporting on which our democracy relies. So without further ado, let me introduce our panel. We have two guests from academia and two from industry. Jay Hamilton is the Hearst Professor of Communication and Director of Stanford's Journalism Program. He is the author of several books, including All the News That's Fit to Sell, How the Market Transforms Information into News. The research in the field of computational journalism, he also is exploring how the costs of story discovery can be lowered through better use of data and algorithms. Jay joined the Stanford faculty this fall. He previously taught at Duke's Sanford School of Public Policy, where he directed the DeWitt Wallace Center for Media and Democracy. He's a graduate of Harvard, where he earned both his BA and PhD. Welcome. Yuri Leskovich is an assistant professor of computer science at Stanford, where he is a member of the Information Lab and the Artificial Intelligence Lab. Yuri joined the Stanford faculty in 2009 after holding a postdoc at Cornell and earned his PhD in machine learning in 2008. His research focuses on mining and modeling large social and information networks and their evolution. He is the author of many articles, including Steering User Behavior with Badges and No Country for Old Members, User Lifecycle and Linguistic Change in Online Communities. Jennifer LaFleur is Senior Editor for Data Journalism at the Center for Investigative Reporting. Previously, she was the Director of Computer-Assisted Reporting at ProPublica and has held similar roles at the Dallas Morning News, the San Jose Mercury News, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. She was the first training director for investigative reporters and editors. She has won several awards for her coverage of disability, legal, and open government issues. Last but not least, Krishna Bharat is a distinguished research scientist at Google. He is the founder of Google News, an automated news service aggregating more than 50,000 sources with 72 editions in over 30 languages. Google News won the 2003 Webby Award in the news category, and Bharat received the 2003 World Technology Award for Media and Journalism. In 2004, he founded Google's R&D operations in India and served as the center's first director from 2006. He holds a PhD in computer science from Georgia Tech, and he is a member of the Board of Visitors of the John S. Knight Fellowships. So, welcome everyone. I'm delighted you're here. So I thought we could talk about three big picture themes and drill down a little bit. The problems and opportunities that computational journalism afford us, the hurdles that we are facing, and next steps that we can take here at Stanford and Columbia to push the ball forward. And then we'll leave time for questions. So I'd like to start with all of you and ask each of you to talk a little bit about your definition of computational journalism, and what are the problems being addressed and the opportunities afforded by the marriage of computer science and journalism. Jay, you want to start? How could computational journalism change the way stories are discovered, presented, aggregated, monetized, archived?
Excellent. So I think computational journalism eventually will be defined by the types of things that people in this room choose to work on. The working definition that I have is that it's a combination of data and algorithms and some knowledge from social science to support the accountability function of journalism. That's the area of computational journalism that I'm working on. I basically think of public affairs coverage, stories about government, as involving a market failure. Because essentially, if you invest a lot of time in writing a story about government, and if public policy changes, if legislation changes or regulations change, as the developer of that story, as the news outlet, you don't get fully rewarded for your work because the benefits of the change in public policy spill over onto many people who are not your readers and viewers. So essentially what that means is that for those of you who've had microeconomics, and how many of you have had micro? All right, a teachable moment, essentially. If you think of a story that changes legislation, that's a positive spillover. We give it a jargon term, positive externalities. And what I think computational journalism can do is help solve that market failure in two ways. One, a supply side, the other, a demand side. On the supply side, computational journalism can lower the cost of discovering stories. That might be helping with technical questions like, the government locked this data up in a PDF, I'd like to get it into Excel, or how do I index the audio or video that I have? Or it could also be discovering stories the way Palantir does it in the War on Terror, but this might be more focused on public interest data mining. So we know institutions break down in systematic ways. Can you use anomaly detection as a form of tip detection, as a way to find stories? So computation can help us lower the cost of discovering stories. On the demand side, computation can also tell us how to tell stories in more engaging ways. When a story is published, the facts are public goods. They circulate freely. And the problem is that as the facts circulate, they become commodities. But if you can tell the story in a different way, if you tell the story in a different way, maybe because your site knows more about the person, the story is personalized, there's some sort of engagement, that raises the probability that you can earn money off of that because of the engagement or because you're offering a unique product. So I view computational journalism in part as a way to sustain very costly and hard to do public affairs journalism, partly on the supply side, partly on the demand side. And what I'm hoping is starting next year, Stanford's going to have something called the Stanford Computational Journalism Lab. And that'll be our way to try to focus on those two research questions, story discovery and story engagement.
Okay. Krishna, what's your take on this scene?
Thank you, Anne. It's a pleasure to be here, by the way. And I feel particularly connected to the Brown Institute because I'm also on the board of Columbia Journalism School. So I run into folks from the Brown Institute at the other end periodically, and I'm back and forth. So my relationship with computational journalism goes back to when I was a grad student at Georgia Tech in '94. It wasn't called computational journalism back then. The web had just been born. So, and there were maybe a handful of newspapers online, and I built this personalized interactive newspaper in Java that would actually render news, crawl news, index it, personalize it, and tweak the layout based on your reading habits and stuff like that. And most people had not yet wrapped their head around the fact that there was a web and there was news on the web, let alone understand what a newspaper looked like on the web. So it was kind of new. But I got really excited about the whole prospect of crunching through text with computers, understanding what the story was about to some degree, understanding what users liked, and trying to match the two and rank it. So that sort of bug stayed in me, and in 2001 I started doing news, which of course is doing this at a much larger scale. And it's, tens of thousands of newspapers in real time, crawled, parsed, indexed, classified by story, classified by geography and category, and then we figured out based on the amount of interest that editors had, how hot that story is for a certain demographic. Because we have so many editions, depending on whether you're in Britain or in California, a certain story may be more interesting or less interesting to you. Also based on the sources you read and your past browsing behavior. So a lot of factors, a lot of signals coming in. We have to make sense of the journalism that is coming out of the journalism community. And we have to understand the repetition of sources over time based on usage behavior. Putting all of that together into a cocktail, we decide how to rank a newspaper. Also search results. So news search is also powered by Google News. So between Google News headlines and Google News search, we send about 10 billion clicks to publishers a month. So that's kind of what we're up to. Now, my focus on computational journalism thus far has entirely been on the distribution side. How do I get those relevant bits to the relevant eyeballs? There's a flip side to that, which is how do those bits come into being? How can computers help with it? So my definition of computational journalism is applying machine intelligence to the problem of furthering journalism. Right? And computers participate in everything. This phone is a computer. Cameras have computers in them. So computers participating as a conveyor of bits which they don't understand, I do not call computational journalism. Computers that actually try to make sense of it, extract some semantics from it, try to extract semantics from the real world and help journalists either create journalism or distribute journalism among those things. That would be my definition. And one way to think about this is, well, Eric, our chairman, likes to say that it's a bug that cars were invented before computers. And he says it just makes sense that computers should drive your car. And it's also worth asking the same question with journalism. So journalism being invented 400 years ago. Imagine journalism being invented from scratch in a post-digital world, when everybody has the ability to post directly to everybody else. Everybody has a phone and a recording device, and everybody is connected to everybody else with social networks, right? How would we go after the traditional challenges of journalism in this new world? It's not just an academic question, it is actually an existential question. It's sort of a vital question that's being asked all over the country and worldwide. So I think it's worth answering it. And I think if we had this kind of society back when journalists started, they wouldn't think that, in a room full of people who can all record the live event that's just happening right now, I should be the one holding the camera and say, stand back, I'm going to take control of this. So yes, you might do a better job, you might take a better picture, you might be able to tell a better story. But that cannot be the mainstay of what you do. So I don't want to minimize the amount of work that great publishers do. Right? An article written by the New York Times said that involves who, what, where, an opinion is probably superior to what most other publications would write. But that it is not a unique product. Right? It's something that everybody else could do. So I think the future of journalism is about creating a unique product, and that unique product should have properties that are non-trivial, that have a substantial technical or expertise bar, and it should make a difference in people's lives by in terms of personal relevance and utility. And it cannot be based on entertainment, because as we know, there's no shortage of options for entertainment. So you can't win on entertainment. You can't win on reporting who, what, where, and what opinion. So it really has to be about insight. What kind of insight I'm talking about? Either truths that will ultimately affect the reader that are hidden, deliberately hidden, and have to be discovered via detective work, classic investigative reporting, or truths that have to be viewed at a distance or from a different angle that are invisible in plain sight. And that's where mining large amounts of data and discovering truths comes in. So I wouldn't say computational journalism is just another tool. It's kind of I think it's a great big hope for journalism going forward, because it is going to make the difference between reporting what everybody else can report and reporting something that's truly unique and valuable. And in fact, as our society becomes increasingly polarized, as social networks reinforce biases, basing journalism not on opinion but on data, I think it's almost like a bomb. It's our best hope for civil debate. So I have great hopes for computational journalism.
Jennifer,
Okay.
what would you like to add to that?
I had all these notes and I scribbled them all out, especially the thing about this being just one tool. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, I do data analysis so I can do stories that no one else can do, which is why I got into this. It's been called precision journalism, computer-assisted reporting when I worked at the San Jose Mercury News back in the day when it was owned by Knight Ridder. I was the database editor. So we've had a lot of turns, but for what I do, it's mostly been about analyzing data to do stories that you can't do any other way. And it's not always just about sifting and sorting through things. It's some of the best projects I've worked on are things like building regression models to look at racial bias in presidential pardons, which we did at ProPublica 2 years ago, or to look at jury selection, which we did at the Dallas Morning News several years ago. It's in a way revealing new data that no one else could do. In 1967, Philip Meyer did something unique. He used social science techniques to analyze a poll of participants in the Detroit riots. This was something completely new. No longer were we just reiterating what people told us or others' reports. We were actually creating data and doing primary research from secondary research. So I think that's a big shift. So, you know, for years we took those techniques, mostly of social sciences, and applied them to journalism. You know, polling, survey, you know, data analysis. What's exciting now is that we can, you know, we kind of finally realize that if we talk to other disciplines who do this stuff, we might understand it better. Talking to economists, for example, might help us do economic stories better. And now talking to computer science scientists, you know, is very exciting for me. Personally, it's exciting because when I was doing my undergraduate degree, I wanted to be a journalist. I wanted to go to journalism school. My family's all engineers, and they were appalled at the notion of me going into journalism. So I double majored in journalism and computer science, and professors on both sides kept pulling me aside and saying, you need to focus on one of these, or you will never succeed at either. So, phooey to them. So, you know, technology, you know, and the things we can learn from you guys is really, really exciting for me. Some of the things that, you know, Jay alluded to some of them, you know, that are really exciting and can do things that we couldn't do before. I mean, keep in mind, for many newsrooms, a pivot table in Excel is high-end analysis, okay? Subtraction is addition's tricky partner. But what I get excited about are things like text mining tools that let us analyze things that aren't rows and columns anymore. We deal with documents, hundreds and hundreds of documents all the time. The ability to extract the information and make sense of it and find patterns in that is incredibly valuable. So I'm really excited to see some of the work on that. You know, remote sensing tools to help us look at land planning and what's going on to, you know, our shores. Sensor journalism, where we put testers out and do things like take temperatures on subway platforms in New York City. You know, network analysis tools. I'm really excited to hear what you have to say. You know, visualization tools, because for us, and it really came to light for me at ProPublica, where every story we did, we pretty much made data available to the public and readers by doing some sort of online interactive app. And then we also made the data available to any journalist who wanted the data to take it to their own newsroom and do their own local story, along with instructions on how to do that. The ability to have those extra tools selfishly helped the life of our stories. I mean, because people would come back again and again and again to see if their doctor got money from a drug company. If it had just been a story, they would have read the story and moved on. So some of those things can really help sustain stories as well. That's all I have.
Okay, so Yuri, can you help us out with your definition and talk to us a little bit about this ubiquitous term, big data?
Sure. So I'll try to add on top of kind of what people already said. So I think one thing that hasn't really been mentioned is that sure, there was basically the idea of creation of stories and, you know, helping journalists. There was the talk about how you now have these stories and you can recommend them to your audience and kind of create personalized newspapers. But I think another thing that is also important is that now, in some sense, for the first time, we really see the whole media ecosystem, you know, from the producers all the way down to consumers. Kind of everything is online on the web. So basically what this really allows us to do is to really understand how the media works. And I think by understanding that, we'll also understand what is the role and place of different types of media and different types of organizations in this ecosystem. So, and this is kind of what our research focus has been, both in terms of trying to understand the audience you are talking to, what kind of language should you use. You know, we have systems that can make fake Reddit stories that get on the front page just by knowing when to post and what to post and things like that. And it's kind of, you know, cute and useful at sometimes. But the other thing we are also trying to understand is, for example, you know, what's the relationship between newspapers or mainstream media and the blogosphere? Is there a competition? Is there some kind of symbiosis and things like that, right? And with the data that we are collecting, so we are collecting around 30 million news articles per day, and we have this for the last 5 years. So basically, we have near complete picture of US online media, everything from kind of Google News style things all the way down to the blogosphere and Twitter. And this really kind of allows us to understand what's going on and how the system works. It's kind of very complex, right? And this then allows us, right, to think about how can we present stories better, right? We talked a bit about visualization. How do we kind of understand things over time? How do we understand, analyze networks or relationships between different aspects of a story, right? So, for example, if you want to understand a complex topic, maybe the Greek debt crisis or the Euro crisis, right? It's like a big spaghetti mess. So how could you now go and tell that thing and maybe have one place where you go and say, this is the big picture of this story, right? And here is, I think, where computation can really help, because we have search engines which are great at surfacing out one small thing once you know what you are looking for. But what kind of when you don't know what you are looking for, right? So I think there kind of computation can help a lot. I'll say that for now.
Okay. Well, two of you said describe data in two very different terms. So you're talking about 30 million
articles. Yeah.
A day, right?
A day, yeah.
Okay, and you're talking about an Excel spreadsheet?
Yeah, I mean, I always it's kind of funny because editors like to talk about big data. Well, journalism big data is nothing near anything that these guys deal with. And I still have, public officials tell me they can't give me a database because there's 10,000 records in it. So yeah, we're not up there. We are, getting to a point where we're analyzing things like Medicare data and things like that are approaching kind of big, but again.
So big for journalists is something that fits into an Excel spreadsheet?
No.
Okay. Creeps a little bit.
So ProPublica recently did some stories based on Medicare Part D data where they had the entire database of Medicare Part D prescribing by physicians across the country. That was about 1 terabyte of data. That's journalism big data. Yours are bazillions of terabytes.
All I want to say, I don't think kind of the absolute size matters, right? Okay. I think really the trouble becomes when you basically want to increase the scale of your analysis for around a factor of 100, right? So if with 10 cases you can look at them in a text file, then you have to go to Excel spreadsheets. What we are doing, we are more like counting words, but again, when you go 100 times bigger, you have kind of technical challenges to solve, and everyone is kind of doing that.
Okay. So, go ahead, please.
I think our goal should be to make processing a terabyte as easy as handling an Excel spreadsheet. Right? Long term. And which means that not everybody needs to be a computer scientist to actually come up with that kind of inference. And there's always going to be limitations to what journalists end up doing if they don't have the right training. But I think our goal should be as a community to progressively expand what they can do.
I completely agree. I mean, we should, I think, teach people to be able to code a bit. It's kind of, being able to write. So it should be at that level, but not everyone has to be a poet. So.
So lots of opportunities. We can save money. We can create new products that offer insight. We can tell stories in new ways using documents and social science techniques. And we can understand the media ecosystem. How about some of the things that are standing in our way to achieve those goals? There are number of obstacles out there. The computer world and the tech world are very different ecosystems, as we discovered in our conversations this week at the Brown Institute. There's a big disconnect between skills and values. Can we talk about that for a little bit? How might we mitigate the culture clash between journalists and technologists? Folks have any thoughts on that? Jen?
Yeah, I mean, I've spent more years than I can admit in this group training journalists and what to use data tools in their reporting. And some reporters that probably never ever would have used these tools did so to do an investigation they could have not done otherwise. So helping people learn how data means an investigation for them and means them doing something no one else could do is really important. And that might mean somebody just learns how to do, a spreadsheet. And that's pretty advanced for a lot of newsrooms. So even just bringing people to the level where they can take information that government agencies, which keep things in computers, and can use that, would be really helpful. I don't think, most reporters get freaked out by a line of SQL, let alone a lot of coding. But I think we can help them use tools that allow them to do analysis. They bring a value to this too. They know the story behind the data, and they will see things. When you just looking at data and hugging it, and holding on to data, you see things in it, that help your reporting, that inform your reporting, that make you ask questions. So, that part of it, that, skills that the reporter has, that insight is really important to bring to the analysis too.
Do you think that journalists are ready to take up the road of learning coding and data analysis?
Like I said, many will not do. If you're talking about writing programs to do like high-level programming, probably not. But if we give them the tools to do analysis, many newsrooms have reporters that can use database managers and spreadsheets and statistical programs and mapping programs. I'm not sure how many of them will be coders, but they can still use data and they can still look at data. And so there's value for them being part of this partnership so that we can do analysis for stories, which is what I want.
And the flip side of this is that one of the things we heard this afternoon is that we, from the tech side, we've got this cool tool, but we're not sure what to do with it journalistically. So let me ask this to Krishna and Yuri. How do you see that progress being made on that front?
So let me first start by saying that the two communities are not that different, because they have, at least if you work for an information company like Google or Yahoo, you're fundamentally concerned about your audience and what they're getting, right? And we call them users, but just it's a terminology difference. But ultimately, we're trying to get information to people, information they care about, information that's relevant. We also care about credibility, and that's the same thing that a good newspaper should care about. And we also care about transparency. Right? We want to make sure inside our organization we conduct ourselves in a way that everybody around us actually appreciates that the mission is central and everything we do is towards that mission. And externally, we want to communicate what our intent is, right? And that we want to be objective and unbiased. So there's a lot in common between what a tech company really considers its values and what journalists traditionally do. I think where it breaks down is in sort of what I would call sort of process stagnation. That is, made sense maybe 3 decades ago, or whatever, and it kind of has been frozen. Tech companies don't do that. They don't stagnate, and they understand that the mission will stay stable, but the mechanism for producing the artifact is going to constantly evolve. Right? There's going to be the way we're going to do our, think about what we are doing 2 years from now is going to be very different from today. So we understand that we're constantly rebuilding, and that we don't do that. They don't do that in journalism. Secondly, I think we grew up with interdisciplinary teams. Right? We have product managers, we have engineers, we have UI designers, and we have marketing people, and they kind of work very closely together, right? And in any startup, they'll be like really close, and even in a big company, they tend to be doing that. And the creative process is not exclusively one discipline, right? So once you get that structure into a journalism organization, and you say, well, it's going to be interdisciplinary. You as the journalist do not have to write all the SQL. Whatever, right? You need to understand what's being written. You may not have to do all of it, and you need to over time get smarter at this process. And you need to get comfortable with the notion that what you're going to do next year is going to be different from this year, and you need to be planning for that evolution. And if you bring in those two things, you'll get most of what you want.
I think that's a great point. I mean, one thing that I would just add to this is that I think there are basically kind of why everything seems to be a bit in the limbo is because there are two things that changed, right? One is kind of how do you want to think about producing stories and using data analysis to be able to come up with a good story. But I think also then in terms of presenting these stories, right? It's not paper anymore, it's the web. Web, it's not just a static HTML, right? It can have visualizations, it can have interactive tools. Then right on the web, it's not only editorial content, it's automatically recommended content. People can comment on the articles, they can upvote and downvote, they can recommend these things to each other, right? So the ecosystem, I think, got much more complex, but also much more interesting, right? And understanding the dynamics of these things, I think, is important for everyone, from maintaining these things all the way to producing stories. So yeah, I think the solution is what Krishna is saying.
A couple of hurdles to the development. One is the government. We've talked about data as if it were there for us, and the president did on his first day in office sign a transparency memo. But if you think about the data that's been released, it's information that helps the government hold other institutions accountable. It's also information that helps you build a business, so-called DC to VC, which is wonderful for this region. But if you think about the data that helps us hold government accountable, this administration has been, just like many others, very unwilling to release that type of voter information. Another hurdle is that in universities, we're trying to do R&D to help a very economically beleaguered industry. It's one where, say, in newspapers, a quarter of the people were fired in a 3-year period. So trying to think about what part of the story generation software that we can subsidize in a way that it gets taken up and sustained. Because if you look across universities, we haven't done a great job with needs assessment with journalists. We have puzzles that we think are interesting, but the tools that have been developed haven't really been propagated. So another big hurdle is figuring out, and this is something the Brown Institute is doing a great job of doing, how can we get CS people to work with journalists to develop tools that have an afterlife? And so far, I think the best example is Document Cloud. But that's being maintained by nonprofit investigative reporters and editors, and it started in part with a burning question in the New York Times. So I think we'll make more progress towards computational journalism if we have universities working with journalists in a way that we try to think about how can we get this tool distributed and used.
I wonder what you all think about other policy initiatives by the government and release of open government data that might retard the growth of computational journalism. We've heard a lot recently about the NSA scandal. There are lots of issues about privacy. Thoughts on that?
Oh, I'll talk about it. Jay has to listen to me rant about this all the time, though. So, I mean, I agree. He said a lot of it. I mean, there was this giant movement that this would be such a transparent administration. Putting up little flashy graphs and, I don't know what they call it. I can't remember the name of the, forget it. Anyhow, is not transparency. It makes us look like you're super transparent, but it's not at all. And I pick on one agency on this because it's a good example of, you know, when data.gov went up, it was going to be this mecca of all government data, a great place for all of us to go and get data. We wouldn't even have to request it through FOIA anymore. And the National Endowment for the Arts there, and they were supposed to be, you know, impactful user sets that, you know, they were supposed to put all their high impact data on data.gov. So the NEA's data on data.gov, last I checked a couple weeks ago, still was a survey about what Americans think about the arts. So what do you think investigative reporters actually want from the NEA? Not a survey. They want to know how they spend the money. And the money is on their webpage in a really poorly formatted way so that most journals couldn't pull it down and pull it into something where they could work with it in rows and columns. So, you know, I don't think it made that big of a difference. Many of the things that we lost post 9/11 still is not back up. Things like dam inspections, you know, that information is still, well, they release data, but it's like the name of the dam and the age of the dam. That's about it. Nothing about whether it should be inspected or anything like that. I'm from the area in Colorado that was horribly flooded, so I'm interested in the topic of dam safety right now, and I don't want to rely on the government to make sure that all those dams are in perfect shape and structure.
Okay. Let me turn to some perhaps economic hurdles that are out there. Given the economic pressures that a public company can face, what are some of the cultural drivers behind some of the algorithms that we are seeing popping up? And how does that impact what gets served up as news and information, and ultimately shape our sense of what public information is and what information is relevant or even real? Jay, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So everybody in this room has, I think, at least 4 information demands. Your life as a consumer, what product do you want? Your life as a producer, as a worker, things that are just fun to know, and things that help you make a better voting decision. And the first 3 markets work relatively well on the demand side, because if you don't get the data, you don't get the benefit. So if you want to go see a movie, you don't hop in a car and follow somebody and hope they take you to a good movie. You look at Rotten Tomatoes or IMDb or something like that. The 4th type of information, voter information, that's beset by a problem called rational ignorance. Because your vote doesn't matter in a statistical sense, most people remain rationally ignorant about most details of public policy. There are journalists in the room, so I have to explain their existence. Like if everybody's rationally ignorant, how do you get public affairs coverage? It's duty. Some people think they have a duty to become informed. It's diversion. Some people think C-SPAN is as interesting as ESPN, and you know who you are. And some people think that it's drama. We can cover politics through the horse race. But what that means is that if you're in a world of chasing eyeballs, for many people, it's going to be the entertainment demand that we had talked about. And in the old days, newspapers were owned by people, by families who were willing to trade off profits for doing the right thing. And if your return was 30%, you could do well and do good at the same time. Now, public affairs is under a real pressure, real economic pressure. And again, that's why I think computational journalism has the potential to help out, and why universities as nonprofits, because one reason universities are nonprofits is we're supposed to generate positive spillovers, maybe through our research, maybe through our engagement. So the bad news about economics, it is a dismal science. I start with rational ignorance, and that explains a lot of what goes on in news markets.
Okay. Let me ask one last question about sort of algorithms and the objectivity of data that is surfaced up to us. There's an assumption that big data numbers can't lie, and because it's data-driven, it's objective. Is it time, do journalists need to, we had questions in the Brown Institute discussions about how do we know how to trust this data? How do we know how the data sausage gets made? I wonder if you all could talk a little bit about the decision making that goes into that, because we all think, oh, if it's big numbers, it's objective, it's neutral.
Right. So I think it's kind of risky. On the one hand, I welcome the fact that data journalism is taking off, and I hope it's going to be big. And I also worry about it for the same reason that I worry about naivete in other places. You can produce a chart that says, how many infections in hospitals, and as an absolute number, unless you normalize with the size of the hospital, number of patients. You'll assume that this new hospital that has very few beds is actually much better than the giant one that has, it's trying its best, but still has infections. So I think there's, how are we going to keep journalists from making these mistakes, these naive mistakes, I think, that ultimately will end up manipulating the public quite a bit. And because it's followed by this claim that this is based on statistics, people will just think, that's correct. And that's how I should pick my hospital. So I don't have a good answer for it. I just think that there's got to be some kind of self-policing within this system. And I think it's kind of odd that journalism is the only sort of corner of the web, if you will, where there isn't a lot of linkage back and forth. The rest of the web evolved around linkage, where if you got it wrong and other people would link to you, and they would link to things that actually matter, and they would call you out and stuff. And journalism websites, sort of newspaper websites, grew up as these walled gardens where nobody would link in, right? So I kind of feel like there should be some accountability mechanism, a la the rest of the web, inside journalism, but that may not be enough. I think data brings great promise, but data also, if used unwisely, can mislead.
I'm happy to talk about that. You know, I mean, I understand your concerns, but, you know, we could use documents wrong, we could interview the wrong people, we can do a lot of things wrong, you know, and that's part of what we do. And I think we do get blowback when there's a problem. You know, and we do have mechanisms for, you know, vetting. You know, when we one of the projects that was a little bit more complicated I did at ProPublica, we produced a white paper and sent that around to experts before our story ever ran. So journalists do vet their analysis.
I actually think that what triggered this thought was I came across this site where they had this table there, you sort by anything. And if you happen to sort by total number of infections, you draw your own conclusions. You walk away thinking,
Right.
this hospital is worse than that hospital. And because they didn't tell you that was not the right thing to sort by, they give you a lot of freedom, but they didn't guide you. So I feel like it's important to understand that on the one hand, we want to give, let the reader discover the story, but make sure that the reader discovers a story that's actually credible.
Well, and you can do that if you just put things for people to sort online. But if you have a story with it that puts it in context, I think that's different. Back to your point about government data and just assuming it's right, I assume all government data is wrong. I don't know a government database that I've gotten that was not riddled with problems. You know, we received data from the U.S. Department of Education, you know, and one of the fields of information we looked at for a project at, and I'll go real quick, at ProPublica was, you know, the number of AP courses that high schools offer. There are 37 possible AP courses you can offer. There were schools with 22,000 AP courses offered. So there are techniques that journalists use to find those errors if they're doing it, you know, thoroughly. So I think there's hope.
Yuri, can you envision a framework, publishing a framework that would describe how the data gets...
I mean, what was said, I think, is great,
stories.
right? Like, kind of, we still need humans to think a bit from time to time. So, what does that mean, right? Is that I think lots needs to be done at the education part, right? That kind of things that don't fit on a line, that's not kind of noise you can remove, but that can be kind of important. And it's not only journalism. I think there are lots of disciplines who kind of need to get data savvy, and I think this will come. And I think it's a danger if people who are manipulating data are kind of not data savvy, in a sense that as you are analyzing data, it's kind of easy to present it one way or another and try to make a point. Of course, this means that people or the readers will have to get more educated, but also the people who are working with this. And, you know, checking your data all the time, and, you know, like 22,000 AP courses, I think is a great example. You have to do your basic analysis first to even say, oh, do I trust this? Is this really what I think this is, before you even start kind of digging deeper conclusions?
You mentioned education. In the master's program here, we're adding courses in data journalism. And yet at the same time, I know that the students who get teched up won't be fully rewarded for the training if they go into journalism, because again, they generate these positive externalities and spillovers. So I think what that means in part is that we as a university have to do a better job fundraising for financial aid to subsidize the creation of those skills. And we also all have to say to some of the students, you can earn a higher return if you go to Wall Street with this set of skills. You can also have a very different impact on the world if you use those skills in journalism. So in a way, they have to trade off money for psychic income. So, but we have to, that explains.
But that's all about
Yeah,
journalism.
Exactly, that's right.
We have a mic here. I know a lot of you may have questions, so if you'd like to line up, I'm going to ask a few closers here, and then we will turn to you, the audience. So 5 years from now, how will we know that the marriage, if we can call it that, of technology and journalism has been successful? And what steps through vehicles like the Brown Institute might we take to realize the opportunities before us? Jay, you started talking about education.
Sure, so 5 years from now, if there are stories told that would not have been told except for the research that went on here, I think that would be a victory. And in part, if we do a better job of recognizing where to look for stories about public affairs, I think that would be a victory. And if we can use the sensor data that Jen was talking about, or the big data that's just generated by government as an artifact of governing. In the old days, if we were looking for WFA, which was waste, fraud, and abuse, we would often have to stake out trucks and things like that with the government. If you can follow it with the data that's available, you can even get a Pulitzer Prize. My favorite Pulitzer Prize from last year was using EasyPass toll booth data from Florida and identifying off-duty police who were speeding. And you'd say, is that a big story? Well, over 20 people were killed or maimed by off-duty police speeding in that state. So that was a story that had a real impact, and it came from big data and computation.
Jen, how about you? What would you be looking for 5 years out?
That most reporters could use and hug and love data, and that newsrooms are still operating in a way that they can use data. There's, I think, almost every year since the early or mid '90s, at least one of the Pulitzers has been a data-based story. So I think people know the power of it. It's just getting the education and the tools to them, which programs like here can do that. So that would be.
Krishna, how about you? How about commercial applications or investments that that Google Ventures might be
I can't speak to
looking
Google
around?
Ventures, but
Okay.
I do think that we may see a resurgence of the investment in journalism by sort of unconventional players, as we're starting to see. For example, in space, right? I mean, you see Jim Branson and Elon Musk sort of made space exciting again by saying, well, I'll make this work. So, and we're starting to see that with, Omidyar and Bezos. And 5 years from now, I would not be surprised if there were a few other committed people who have experience in a different discipline who are decided that they're going to try and make this thing work. And because the size of investment needs to be quite substantial, and then you need to be willing to wait for the returns to come and really rethink the model. And focusing entirely on high impact, personal relevance journalism. And it may not even, the only output of that it may be more than journalism. It may be services, information services that actually make a difference. I was kind of, impressed by this sort of dialysis center tracker that ProPublica did. And there are other examples. Walk Score tells you how good a city is to walk in, and if you want to change your neighborhood. So trying to get into the heads of people and why they might want that news, and trying to solve that problem holistically, and not just like, here's one article you should read, but here is a place you can keep going back to every time you have that thought in your head. So people who actually think it through and invest technology in it, and hire the right skill sets, I think will come forward, and they'll build new organizations.
Yuri, what's your take on this?
Sure.
There's lots of different buckets here: network analysis, machine learning, natural language processing.
As a consumer of news, right, I would kind of like to see a screen that's more interesting than kind of blank with a few letters on it, right? So I think that is where lots of innovation should also go, is just in kind of presenting the stories, making them more interesting. It would be interesting, right, kind of trying to understand the big picture, or trying to understand what is one media site saying about this topic versus the other one. So kind of trying to summarize what's going on rather than just kind of surfacing out individual articles, just kind of, white page with black text on it. I think that's a place where people will then also get more engaged and more enthusiastic about news, so that can kind of revive the whole industry.
Okay, great. So we have some questions.
Thanks everyone, fascinating panel. Facebook just announced an interesting plan just like a week ago to substantially change their newsfeed algorithm, and they say it's to prioritize quality news based on input from users. And so my question is, given that Facebook and networks like it mediate a huge part of the world's attention, online attention, 10-20%, how might people in this room, in this field, find pathways to work with and influence Facebook to improve that, make that better, and particularly to diversify and make more global that news feed that's happening there?
I can talk briefly about that. talking about ProPublica too much. I should be talking about CIR. But one thing we were able to do at ProPublica is interface some of our apps with Facebook. So we did an education app looking at the opportunity gap for kids' access to certain programs. And as part of that, you could pick your school, compare it to local schools, and put that on your Facebook page. So we actually got a lot of positive feedback from people being able to share that information on Facebook.
I don't know specifically what they're doing, but that said, from the outside, if you take a company like Facebook, with the fact that they have such a strong brand that they need to protect, I would imagine they're making their best effort at ranking this thing based on the signals they're getting. And that said, any ranking algorithm is as good as people who created it, good as the intentions are, and there's room for improvement. So I do think that if they are promoting what they consider to be good news based on signals, there may be room for improvement there, and people who have analyzed it and feel like there is room for improvement should write about it, blog about it, and some of that will actually get to them, and then maybe it'll get better. So I think we have to start out with the assumption that a company that has a lot to lose by being biased is probably trying not to be biased, and is doing the best it can, but there's always room for improvement.
Okay. I think if I understood your question correctly, I think what you wanted to ask was really, in some sense, so Facebook is ranking the newsfeed for a while now. They come up with some metrics, which is, they want to keep you on the site as long as possible. They want you to like as many stories as possible, and so on. So they are now, in some sense, skewing your view of the world, and you are worried about that skew, I guess. Was that kind of the question?
Well, I think that's true, and I think it's inherent. Anybody that's composing a feed for you, even Twitter in a sense. And I don't want to criticize them or be negative. I see it more like a great opportunity. They've actually announced to the world that we're being told by our users that we want quality news, and they also have this amazing scale, and they're also globally bridging, and they have international social capital and so on. And to me, it's like, well, that's fantastic. Surely that's some kind of welcome map for people like in this room coming from computational journalism to bring that expertise to help them achieve that worthwhile goal.
I wanted to say I completely agree with you in a sense that, Google is doing this with ranking, and they are doing a great job, and they are not skewing your view of the world, or even if they do, you are happy with it in some sense, right? Facebook is similar, so in a sense, and right, there are kind of short-term gains and there are long-term effects, and I think one thing that we learned from Google and other companies is that it's kind of, you have to be careful how you do this ranking, but if you do it well, people will like it in a sense. And I know the Facebook news ranking team, so they are really good guys that are trying to do the good thing, and the users will tell whether that's the good thing or not.
Yes, they already are talking about it, so maybe that's why they like the announcement. Thanks.
Hi. A lot of government disclosure comes in the form of PDF or image files, might contain tables, but it's not usually very easy to work with. I work with local government financial disclosure, so I've seen PDFs being all the maps and printed from an application, whatever, all very hard to work with. There are a lot of tools out there that purport to help you with that, but I find that they fall into two categories. One is very, very expensive, or second is very, very limited. And I'm wondering why you think that's the case, why this field of working with unstructured data and being able to get it into a usable, analyzable form hasn't developed faster, and what do you think might be the way forward?
Well, as you said, there are very expensive tools. So if you're doing an antitrust case, you're not going to be challenged because you can afford to spend for that software. I think it goes back to the fact that the newspapers who are doing the public affairs coverage, they have very little money, but there are people who are stepping into this, like the Sunlight Foundation is having a hackathon in San Francisco in January around this very issue, PDF to Excel. There's a Knight Mozilla fellow who has worked on PDF to Excel. There's a nonprofit in North Carolina that has developed something called DocHive, which is they'll take a form, and once they've figured out how to to take that information from the form and put it into Excel. They'll put it up on the web and other people can follow that form. So I think this is a general case of there are tools that if you're in the medical field, if you're in the law field, or if you're in the war on terror, you've got great software. You have great resources. If you have to worry about people all around you being fired, you don't go and say, there's this great software we need to buy. And so that's why I think nonprofits are going to be the people who help with that bridge. And that's a product placement for the Sunlight Hackathon in mid-January, which is going to be in San Francisco.
And thanks for plugging that. That's my hackathon.
I knew that. I knew that, although we hadn't rehearsed. Yeah.
Okay.
What I'm impressed is when you look at the newspapers, they all have their stories to tell. But lately, if you take Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and USA Today, and San Francisco Chronicle, they all have a lot of data now in the back pages, other than politics. One way or the other they say this and that. But you go into science, you go into technology, they have a tremendous amount of data that's being published in a colorful way. Thanks to big data, there is data there, they have to show it in a graphics form, a lot more impressive type of fonts that they use, and it's very pleasant. And you can read it in about a half hour and you get the view of the world or whatever everybody says, they decide to show it. And I think it's all because of the behind the scenes people are doing all the data analysis. Granted, there is politics that they twist their stories. You read Wall Street Journal, the healthcare is going downhill. You read New York Times, it's getting better. The sites are this and that. But I think more to come. But and also you need to thank all the engineers and scientists that have the storage capabilities, mining this data and keeping this data. Terabyte of data used to be a lot 30 years ago. Now it's $15, $20 USB drive. So, and I think we're getting better, and I think we just need to continue to do a good job exposing and mining data that isn't statistical, but more of a, material that's published by writers, like English, like picking their whatever the keywords are. But I think we'll get better. I have a lot of hope. What do you agree?
I hope so, or I won't have a job. But, yeah. I think the tools are a lot more affordable, a lot more accessible than they were, back when I started doing this. A little website called Inside Climate News had just 4 reporters scattered around the country, and they were able to do an analysis to look into one of the biggest oil spills in the country, and won a Pulitzer for national reporting earlier this year. This tiny little newsroom, because they were able to analyze that data. So I think it is getting better.
But you mentioned the New York Times. The New York Times can aggregate up the attention of college-educated people around the country and then use that to cover the fixed cost of dealing with very expensive data. But there is no New York Times, say the place I moved from, Durham, North Carolina. There aren't enough people there whose attention can be monetized. And in work that I'm doing now on the information lives of low-income individuals, if you're not somebody's marginal viewer or marginal consumer, very few stories are being told about your community for you. And in fact, some of the research I've done indicates that if you're a low-income individual on the web and trying to find a job and you type in like UPS job, you can be led to a site where people get your information and then sell you as a lead to for a for-profit education company. So it gets better for some people in an age of income inequality, for college-educated people, but for other people, it's not getting as better as fast because of the inherent market values.
Just say, I used to live in a small town in Texas, so you would expect that the local community newspaper has about 2 pages of community news that interests them. I used to live in Sweetwater, Texas, 12,000 people. But what's happening is that these newspapers are all owned by regional owners, and they just print what everybody else gives them, AP and all that. So you're right, it's like banking, you need to allow them to flourish in the local community. Expect New York Times to cover some issue, unless it becomes a big TV news, it's hard to productivity.
So isn't that an age-old problem? Like there are parts of the world where we don't cover for the wrong reasons, and we should be covering them. Maybe because they're not part of the subscriber base, or because they're just not very affluent. And how have we traditionally solved that as well?
We've always had the problem of rational ignorance, the fact that it may not pay for you in an investment sense to get some of this news. In the past, let's say in the 1980s, there were two industries that were dominated by family or individual ownership: sports franchises and news outlets. And that's because people had some sort of psychic return for being a community player. Then with the change in tax laws, a lot of the individuals sold out to chains, and then the fiduciary responsibilities to maximize profits. So in the old days, you did have some people who were willing to engage in more than profit maximizing public affairs. One of the nice things about the dramatic drop in stock prices is that now you have people coming back in who are as individuals like Jeff Bezos and being able to buy the Washington Post. So maybe if we have more people, and you talked about Omidyar, with extreme wealth, then they can try to run experiments.
Okay, well, we are out of time, and I'd like to end this on a hopeful note. I think that there is lots of promise in the field of computational journalism, and we will see how it unfolds over the next 5 years. And certainly, technology contains within it the seeds of journalism's rebirth. So stay tuned. Thank you, esteemed panel. Great comments. We'd like to also thank the Brown Institute, Bernd and Mark Hansen for hosting this event, as well as the John S. Knight Fellowships, Jim Bettinger. Thank you very much. Special thanks to Kelly Yilmaz, who helped us get organized. And we can continue the conversation upstairs. We're going to have a reception straight up in the Nexus Center. So thanks, everybody, for coming.